All right, Hanna Notte is a senior research associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, which means she knows a lot of stuff about nuclear weapons and all of that stuff. So, Hanna, how are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Is it
glad to be joining?
Yeah, good to talk to you. Do you believe this Swedish television report that Russian jets armed with nuclear weapons penetrated Swedish airspace and had to be intercepted earlier this month? And how serious is that?
I saw those reports, Dana. I think that they are entirely credible. I find it conceivable that at this time, Russia would engage in such acts of brinkmanship in the sort of broader European theater to mark its red lines vis-a-vis NATO, not to engage in the Ukraine conflict beyond what we're currently seeing. And so I don't have any additional information on that, but I find it entirely conceivable. It is dangerous, but I think that NATO, the United States, have so far acted very cautiously and very professionally in the face of such Russian brinkmanship.
You've been to Moscow, and you've studied President Putin, maybe not as your field of study, but there's a lot of things that have happened in Russian foreign policy and nuclear proliferation, and all under Putin's watch. Is he the Russian leader you thought he was, given what's going on in Ukraine?
I have to say that up until the invasion on February 24th, and in fact, I was in Moscow until February 23rd, so the day before the war started, I was, like many, hoping that the buildup of troops around Ukraine, the hostile rhetoric, the Russian kind of difficult negotiating position on the security guarantees that it put forward were all part of coercive diplomacy to see what one could get at the negotiating table from NATO, from the United States. And so in that sense, I was surprised by this invasion. You know, with hindsight, going back to the speeches that he gave, the kind of rhetoric that we've seen from him on Ukraine, which clearly indicate for years that he just simply does not see Ukraine as an independent nation. Perhaps we should have, read those kinds of speeches with greater concern and seen them more as a warning than we did.
Is this some kind of evolution of President Putin, do you think, and especially maybe a more compressed one in the last 2 years where he's been more isolated in the pandemic? Do you think that these are all kind of natural positions that he would take, given the statements that he's made in the past about, the great catastrophe of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and he has spoken out against NATO enlargement? I mean, he's kind of gone from first gear to fourth pretty quickly, though.
I agree with that, Dana. I think there has been an evolution in the man Putin. I don't think that he was always hell-bent on doing what he's doing now. In fact, I do believe that when he first came to power, perhaps in the early 2000s, there were even opportunities of constructing a different kind of relationship with this Russian Federation under Putin after 9/11, for instance. And then certainly, the reason that we're now seeing this invasion has also to do with his reading of the international situation. So there's been a hardening of Putin's stance, I would say, over the last few years. And then there's been this added calculation, I believe, that we have a new president, or relatively new US president in the White House, withdrew from Afghanistan, is very focused on China. So I think that Putin did not anticipate the kind of American attention and NATO unity that we're now seeing. Perhaps he thought, okay, Merkel is leaving the office in Germany. We have a new German government that's still figuring out its bearings. So perhaps the Europeans won't have leadership, will be distracted. So I do believe that the reading of the international situation, plus the hardening of his own position, perhaps his thinking about his legacy, the kinds of things he wants to accomplish before he leaves the Russian scene, having done a lot of that domestically in the last few years by sort of decimating the Russian opposition, now turning his attention to the international tasks, that all of these things came together.
With one goal being the restoration of the Soviet Union, or the restoration of an imperial Russia that is so far undefined?
I think it's neither of those completely capture it. I think it's sort of Russia certainly perceives an entitlement to a sphere of privileged influence in its immediate neighborhood, wants a buffer zone, between itself and NATO, and therefore Belarus and Ukraine form an important part of that. And so, as to whether Russia would necessarily go further than that, I don't think that is necessarily what President Putin thinks Russia needs for its national security. I think what he certainly wants is the destabilization of European societies, sowing division, and so it can do a lot of that with hybrid means, with disinformation. Not necessarily needs to invade other countries beyond Ukraine, and I believe probably won't have the military bandwidth to do so anyway anytime soon.
Not now. I mean, a lot of people think that they have failed so badly in Ukraine. If it's any kind of an example for the Kremlin, it's, you can't go any further because you didn't even get this far. And whether he wants to have this buffer zone, it's a buffer zone right now of the unwilling, that he seems, prepared. Pardon my coarse statement here. He seems prepared to pave it if he can't win it over.
And that's the big concern. I agree with you going forward, how far Putin's willing to go in Ukraine in terms of the military means that he's prepared to undertake if he doesn't achieve gains that at least will allow him to negotiate with the Ukrainians from a position of strength at the negotiating table. And right now he is not able to do that. Okay,
let's talk about how far he is willing to go, because I covered his war in Chechnya, and he was willing to do anything, quite frankly, including using fuel air bombs in cities, which he has done now, and he has used cluster munitions, and he has used this heavy shelling and bombing to the point of just basically destroying any kind of infrastructure in depopulation. So that is why I became so interested in some of the things that you've written about, where you're drawing parallels with Syria. And, in a way, Mariupol mirrors what we saw in Aleppo to some degree. So you talked about 5 parallels with Syria. The first one, you said sequential war. Can you lead me through that?
That's right. Yeah, sure, Dana. So if you look at Syria, and we got to go back a couple of years, the Russian government, which was, of course, militarily supporting the Assad government starting in 2015, what you saw in 2016, 2017 was that they declared some de-escalation zones, that's what they called them, in western parts of the country. Ceasefires were declared. The Assad government was then enabled to turn its attention further east, take more territory, and then eventually the Russians and the Syrians came back to those de-escalation zones, Eastern Ghouta, Homs, Dera, in 2018, and basically said, now we'll take these territories over. So, as I was thinking through whether something similar might be possible in Ukraine, of course, one has to acknowledge that the Ukraine campaign is a very different ballgame. I'm not necessarily saying that we will see a similar sequencing here, but certainly I think we should say the mere fact that the Russians are declaring phase 1 over, focus on the quote unquote liberation of the Donbass, and we're seeing some forces pulling back from around Kiev, shouldn't give us too much cause for optimism that the fighting there is over. I mean, in fact, I believe we saw yesterday that some military attacks on Kiev and around Chernihiv actually prevailed. So it's mostly sort of a cautionary note to say that when Russia announces these phases, the game is not yet over necessarily.
Right. And if you were a military commander on the ground for Ukraine, then you probably would have to think twice about allowing those troops to withdraw peacefully, because you know very well that they may regroup. I mean, if the Syrian model applies, they may regroup in Belarus, and you may be facing them in a few months' time again.
That's right. And I think what we're also seeing is that certainly not all Russian troops will withdraw from the north and from around Kiev, because they don't want to give the Ukrainians the bandwidth to move all their forces towards the east either, because they want to, have the military upper hand there. So I think we have to look at these things very, very carefully going forward.
Talk to me about encirclement and corridors. I mean, I feel like I'm watching an old siege of a town by the Romans, and that, military tacticians haven't evolved very much, but what they're doing is inhuman but very effective.
Dana, I think the most infamous siege that we can recall from the Syria campaign was the siege of Aleppo in 2016, which lasted for, I think, over 6 months. And, you know, the population there, similarly to the terrible news we're hearing now from Mariupol, was deprived of food, of water, of sort of basic needs. The Russians eventually provided humanitarian corridors there, but those were often hampered by violence. Civilians distrusted these corridors because there was very minimal international oversight of sort of securing them. And so I think a lot of people didn't leave. And if we look at the timeline of the siege of Mariupol to date, I believe we've had, and I just sort of went back to check this, I think we had humanitarian corridors being declared twice. On March 5th was the first one, but there quickly the ceasefire also collapsed and then a safe corridor couldn't be established. Then we had another one, I believe in mid-March, and then I believe we have a ceasefire being declared today. So there's another hope on the Ukrainian side that you can bring some people out. But let's not forget, 170,000 people are estimated to remain trapped in Mariupol. And so there's one.
You have to pause for a sec, right? And you have to think about, not you, but we have to think about that number. Because when you look at that rubble, you cannot imagine that somewhere in it, under it, there are 170,000 people who still remain behind from what was a city of 500,000.
That's right. And the concern is not just about the viability and the safety of establishing corridors to bring people out. There's another example from the Syria campaign I'd like to draw the attention to, because we always hear the Aleppo comparison, but what you had with the humanitarian corridors from the de-escalation zones in 2018 from, for instance, the suburbs of Damascus, Eastern Ghouta, was a Russian rhetoric that said, people may leave, we have the corridors now, but those who stay will effectively enmesh themselves with the terrorists and hence become legitimate targets for when military activity resumes. And that is also, I think, a sort of a warning to us all that, you know, we might see a sort of similar rhetoric.
If you don't get out, you're a terrorist. And if you stay behind, you're a target. But you can't get out. You know, women and children cannot get out, and older people cannot, and a lot of older people just don't want to go. They don't know where to go.
And Dana, on the you can't get out, here's another parallel that we're seeing between Syria and Ukraine. Now, Russia claims that all civilians are free to leave, and the reason that they may not leave is because they are used as human shields by the enemy on the ground. So in Syria, for years, the Russians would often claim that the terrorist groups, quote unquote, on the ground would keep civilians as human shields and prevent them from leaving. And on Mariupol, we've seen the same Russian rhetoric in briefings from the Russian Defense Ministry, where they say we have 7,000 Azov fighters and sort of right sector battalions in Mariupol, and they're also using the civilians as human shields. I think Putin even said it himself in some of his remarks in early March. So there's another parallel for you there.
All right, so there's 3 of the 5: sequential war, encirclement and corridors, and human shield. And then you move on to the 4th, which is foreign fighters.
That's right. I mean, it's foreign fighters, and actually one could add mercenaries. So one thing I'd like to point out is that we had a private military company, Wagner, present in Syria at various stages during the war. This is a Russian PMC. And there have been reports sort of anecdotally about PMC Wagner also appearing in Ukraine, though those are very hard to corroborate. And then we have the whole issue of foreign fighters, which is actually sort of multi-layered. So on the one hand, Russia argues against foreign fighters. It says in Syria, foreign fighters intervened to join the armed opposition to precipitate regime change, and Russia had to intervene to prevent the regime from falling. So it was sort of making a claim about the internationalization of that conflict. Similarly, in Ukraine, the Russians have claimed that thousands of quote unquote foreign mercenaries and terrorists have joined the armed forces of Ukraine. And so they are to be ruthlessly destroyed. That's how the Russian military put it last week. Yet at the same time, Russia itself wants to use foreign fighters in that war. I mean, that's the sort of perfidy of the situation.
And the reports are that they've recruited some 16,000. Nobody can confirm those numbers, right? And they're paying them people that will fight from Libya, from Syria. Chechnya, by the way, is not a foreign fighter because they are Russian